Our fragile blue planet, place of beauty, mystery, and wonder. But its 4.5 billion years point to a violent and destructive past. Asteroid strikes, ice ages, mass extinctions, dinosaurs, mammoths, dodos, whole species wiped out. Nothing survives here long. Not even us. The Mayans were obsessed with calculating time. 1,000 years after they disappeared, their lunar calendar is still accurate to 34 seconds. 34 seconds. And they predicted the end of time. Can we afford to ignore them? Today, scientists make predictions based on empirical evidence, and they have their own dire warnings for us. Imagine if the ancient Mayans had seen what we've seen in the last few years. Hurricane Katrina, the earthquakes in Haiti and Japan, volcanoes in Iceland and Chile. Our planet is locked in mortal conflict with the forces of nature. 13 centuries ago, Mayan priests wrote a warning that the world will end in apocalypse. They climbed to the roofs of the houses, but the houses crumbled under their feet. They tried to mount to the tops of the trees, but the trees hurled them from them. They sought refuge in the caverns, but the caverns closed before them. These keepers of primeval mysteries calculated time on a grand scale, unimaginable to other ancient cultures. But after 5,125 years of counting, their calendar stops dead on a very specific date. Mayan Year Zero. Surely it's just a story.
Streets will be see-through. A tree of healing for the nations, we will eat the fruit. No sun, no stars in the green room. Just the glory of God in his people. No pain, no sorrow, no evil. No death, no tomorrow, no greed, dude. No shame, no boredom, no seas blue. Dear Lord, I don't know when I'ma see you, but I can't wait, and I pray that it'll be soon.
You hear that like the flash, you hear that thunder roll. Can't wait to crash back. This song should come and close. Who broke the righteous path? Who had a love with those? This ain't to crash, relax. Yeah, when that trumpet blows. When that trumpet blows. Yeah, when that trumpet blows. When that trumpet blows. Yeah, when that trumpet blows.
What's happening here, just as a preliminary remark, is that the Greek world has now been spread to the rest of the ancient Near East. We looked at Alexander the Great last week, and as you know, at the very height of his career, he dies. So he's only in his early 30s. And we have about a 15-year period in which his entire domain is up for grabs. And all of these generals who had served together in his military now turn on each other, and it's kind of a bloodbath for about 15 years. But when the dust settles, which most would say is about the year 308, you have essentially a fourfold division of his empire. And so that 15 years is rather chaotic, but what comes out the other end of the story is this, relatively neat division of the empire of Alexander into those four, as it were, slices of pie. As the verse says here, he shall turn back and pay heed to those who forsake the holy covenant. There were some in Jerusalem who were willing to, by this time, forsake their own religion and support loosely using the term, the reforms that were going to be put in place by Antiochus, and so that's what takes place. This becomes this moment of great abuse in Jerusalem. He does several things. For one thing, he tore down a bunch of houses in Jerusalem to build a defensive fortress to prevent the Romans from making any further incursions into his own territory. But he does a few other things that are really calculated to simply insult the Jewish psyche, and especially the Jewish religion. He changed the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel, to Zeus Olympus. That's who we now are going to worship. He ordered the Jews to begin sacrificing pigs to Zeus. And if you know anything about Jewish religion, you know how abhorrent that would be. He prohibited the celebration of Sabbath days, festivals, or the rite of circumcision. He committed what's sometimes called the abomination of desolation, mentioned by Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, in which he went to the temple and took a pig and slew it on the brazen altar right there in the holy precincts in front of the temple. He plundered the temple treasury, and he left troops. As he left town, he left a bunch of troops behind him to carry out what amounted to a reign of terror over the next 3 years or so there in Jerusalem. Forces sent by him shall occupy and profane the temple and fortresses. They shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate. So this incident in particular was the one that was probably the most outrageous from the Jewish point of view, in which he commits this abomination of desolation, sacrificing a pig. That happened to take place on December 5th, 168 BC.
When Antiochus Epiphanes, a Syrian Greek general, came into Jerusalem, took over the Temple Mount, roasted a sow on the brazen altar of sacrifice, and set up a statue of Zeus on the Temple Mount, declaring Zeus to be God. He did it on Zeus's birthday, December 25th.
Now, this is the one that people should be the most familiar with. This is Yeshua's sacrifice.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, there was 3 hours of darkness, and it says the moon and the sun was eclipsed. Well, we have a problem there. You cannot have a double eclipse in a normal state. It takes a new moon to make a solar eclipse, and a solar eclipse caused by the moon can only give you 7.3 minutes of darkness. Okay? But the text says there was 3 hours. Well, if you take a close look at this, a solar eclipse in a natural state only covers a small section of the earth with darkness. The text says the whole earth was darkened, as well as outside text that says the whole earth was darkened during this period. Rome was darkened during the same time as Jerusalem, as well as parts of Africa. All of that area of the known world was darkened. That can't happen from a lunar eclipse.
You heard it right. According to the data, this planet X was there during the time of the crucifixion. But with all the research, documents, charts, and calculations that Gil has carefully analyzed, there was no way we could explain each and every account in great detail with this documentary. But I felt it important we touch upon a few, the crucifixion being one of them. Remember what I said earlier. We are analyzing Planet X 7X's timeline of events with the Bible through the eyes of a literal interpretation.
What's interesting about Yeshua's sacrifice at that time period, our biblical records mentions 2 eclipses at the same time, and that's impossible on a normal circumstances, because the moon is what causes a solar eclipse. To have a double eclipse, it has to involve a third body, because this was Passover. The moon is on the wrong side of Earth for it to be involved in front of the sun. And there's outside text as well that qualifies this, that the entire Earth was darkened. The moon can only darken a small sliver of shadows that goes over certain country regions at the time. It doesn't darken the entire Earth. The moon can only give you 7.3 to 7.5 minutes of darkness. And this was documented even outside the Bible as 3 hours of total darkness.
Therefore, according to the research, you cannot have a double eclipse without a third object. Meaning, in order to have a solar eclipse, it cannot be during a full moon phase cycle. But according to the Bible, the sun was eclipsed for 3 hours. If that is the case, then during the crucifixion, the moon would have gone up to eclipse the sun for 3 hours, gone back down in its rightful position, only to go back up once again after the sun had set. This is not scientifically possible, since science teaches us that the moon can only block the sun for 7 minutes, giving credence to Gil's third object blocking the sun.
That's a sizable body that passed in front of the sun that blocked us, causing also the eclipse of the moon. The model shows that this object was between 6.5 and 7.5 times the diameter of Earth.
It becomes obvious as you study all these texts that the main feature they are talking about is a day of darkness, darkness at noon, the sun will not be seen, etc., which we can say they are really talking about the solar eclipse. And the Syrian records, I think that's what I showed in the previous slide, talk about a darkness at noon and an eclipse at an unexpected time, because all these eclipses could be predicted. They had enough knowledge to predict solar eclipses, lunar eclipses, etc. So in exactly 556 BC, and this is a sketch, a sky map prepared by NASA, not by me, in 556, an unusual and unexpected eclipse darkness at noon took place. And it is my conclusion in the book the end of days, that is exactly when Nibiru last was near Earth and created that eclipse.
When Jesus was asked, what are the signs of the times, what are the signs of your coming, one of the comments was, there will be more earthquakes in diverse places, different places, and the analogy was given of earthquakes being in labor pains, meaning they will become more frequent and more intense. Now, this has been a highly debated topic, and so I'd like to discuss that a little and remove the facts from the myths. If you consult the USGS, they will tell you point blank, or they have actually released press releases stating that there are in fact no increase in worldwide earthquakes. And if you ask them why there's much more data today in earthquakes, they will contribute it to the sensitivity of the sensors. And there's thousands of more sensors being put out every year around the world, and the sensors are becoming more sensitive.
So the appearance of more earthquakes is just an illusion.
It's
caused by more of the ability to observe in more places at the same time.
Correct. But let's separate. It's misleading. It's misleading data. Because let's separate the micro tremors, which is not what Christ was talking about. He was talking about earthquakes, which you could obviously feel would be more intense. So we're talking about the intense earthquakes. So what we have done is we have taken all the USGS data we obtained directly from USGS for the last 100 years. Millions and millions of data points of USGS data. We've taken that data, we have downloaded it, we have researched it, we have studied it, we have separated every single piece of data that could not be picked up literally worldwide from the poorest sensor 100 years ago. So that when you strip out all the data of all the sensors, of all the noise from 100 years ago, and only look at earthquakes that have a magnitude of 6.3, and by the way, 100 years ago, any earthquake of 6.3 and higher, no matter where that earthquake existed on Earth, everybody on Earth could feel that earthquake. The sensors could pick it up. The sensors, I say, could pick up that earthquake wherever it happened. So using that as the basis in analyzing the data, I'd like to quickly show you the results of that data.
Arguably, one of the most commonly discussed natural signs in the end days is the dramatic increase of earthquakes around the world, something that in geological time would be statistically unprecedented if it were actually happening during what many believe is the last generation.
That in the last days there'd be an increase in great earthquakes. Jesus used verbiage that means bigger earthquakes in unusual places. We're looking at things regarding, for example, greater hurricanes, greater typhoons, things that in nature you can sense that things are coming undone. And yet, if you looked at it naturally, you would say, well, this is due to global warming, or this is due to man's bad stewardship of the earth. But yet the Bible said as we approached the end, this is exactly what we would see, which, by the way, that preempts man's involvement.
The scriptures do tell us that earthquakes, specifically earthquakes, will increase in frequency and in intensity.
But wait a minute. Hasn't the U.S. Geological Survey, or USGS, gone on record to state that this is not occurring, that no such increase in earthquakes have been detected around the world?
Because this is such a debated topic, the USGS gave a press release saying that this was not occurring. As a result, we actually decided to take the USGS data, millions of data points, spent months downloading it, analyzing it, graphing it, studying it. The results were absolutely terrifying.
Despite what you may have heard in the past, this is the compiled data from the USGS from over the last 100 years. Keep in mind that we're not talking about the millions of microtremors that can now be detected from the distribution of more numerous and sensitive sensors, but strictly data from the larger earthquakes that can be felt by people beginning at 6.3 and up on the Richter scale, that could be easily detected by early 19th century sensors from virtually anywhere in the world. This data shows what the USGS and other organizations do not want you to see.
It shows that the earthquakes are increasing in intensity and they are increasing in frequency. This is exactly the description that was prophesied.
Unlike our Sol, a brown dwarf lacks the mass to sustain a nuclear furnace, so they are by nature very dim and difficult for astronomers to observe. Also, they can be surrounded by a dust disk, as shown in this artist's illustration, which makes them even more difficult to observe, because Nemesis has a dust disk. Let's take another look at it. If we were to imagine that we are floating in space with Nemesis before us, it would probably look somewhat like this. It would be dark and surrounded by an ever-shifting dust disk that would only make it even more difficult to observe. It is why Chilean astronomer Carlos Ferrada, the man to theorize about the existence of Nemesis, called it the black star. He called it black for a good reason. The part of the light spectrum that is visible to the human eye is a narrow band between the 400 to 700 nanometers range. This is why the Planet X system will need to be much closer to our Sun before it is visible everywhere on the planet. We also looked at the predictions of remote viewer Major Ed Dames about these times and what the Colburn Bible tells us to expect. The first passage of Manuscripts 3:4 begins with, "When blood drops upon the earth, the destroyer will appear, and mountains will open up and belch forth fire and ashes." This is a key passage, so let's take a moment to study it. When blood drops upon the earth refers to the iron dust cloud surrounding the Planet X system. The destroyer will appear. What this tells us is that the iron dust cloud precedes the arrival of the destroyer, which in this case is Planet X, the ancient Hebrew and Egyptian description for this mini constellation. And the rest just doesn't get any better.
And this baby's out there in the sky. They've been watching it. I watched it, and I can tell you, this thing has got so much trash coming around it. You know how we live in a solar system? We've got 9 planets and a big sun. This thing has got 7 planets and its own sun. But I believe that instead of having dirt on it like our planet does and water, I think this thing is just a big, bright reddish-orange iron ball because it's giving off all this red iron oxide dust out into the atmosphere. When we thought At first, it was just a teeny little red speck of fuzzy red dust in the distance, but over the years as it went by and we watched it, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then finally, about '08, we could see this thing like it was across the street, and we could see that it was a blazing hot ball of fire giving out sparkles of red iron oxide dust for thousands of miles in every direction. This thing looks like a giant red teardrop-shaped dust cloud, and you can see once if you're able to see it up close like we did, you can see every speck out there.
So is it a planet or a failed star?
It's not a failed star. I saw this thing up close. It did not look like a failed star. It looked just like our sun.
Right.
Okay. Would you call our sun a failed star?
No. Okay, well, you had said planet. I wasn't sure if it was like a failed star brown dwarf or a full sun. So it's a full sun?
It looks to me like a miniature sun, just like the one we have. The only difference is our sun is giving off flames and stuff, and this one's doing the same thing as it, but it's giving off this red iron oxide cloud of dust around it, and until it got close, we couldn't even tell what was in there. We could see it was hot, and it looked like it was just a dull red when we were first able to discern it through the red cloud. But as it approached, it started to become more apparent that this thing is just orange hot. I mean, to tell how hot it is, I was told that they estimated between 5 and 10 million degrees, but I don't really know if that's right or not. I mean, it's got to be pretty hot because it's sending all of this red iron oxide dust out into space around it,
right?
And it's got this enormous, and I mean enormous, at least 50 or 100,000 miles on each side of it, this red dust cloud that goes all the way around it. I know when we were watching it, as it started to make the upward swing to approach behind our sun, it was amazing. The red dust cloud settled down. Instead of being round, it started to settle down into a V, like wings, upside-down wings.
Right.
And I thought, boy, I wonder if that's where the ancient Sumerians got the idea this thing had wings, because, centrifugal force is a funny thing. When it comes back up around the planet, when we see it in the sky, my guess is it's going to look like it's got wings, because centrifugal force is going to be pulling the red iron oxide dust and particles out to one side, and then as it starts to climb out and go away from us, listen.
And the rest just doesn't get any better.
New scientific reports are providing spectacular details on the comet sighting Spring's close encounter with the planet Mars. According to NASA investigators, the effects of the encounter on the Martian magnetosphere were as dramatic as they were surprising. In October of 2014, the comet passed within 87,000 miles of the red planet, and scientists with NASA's MAVEN mission were amazed at the effects on Mars's upper atmosphere. MAVEN team member Jared Espley said in a recent statement, "We think the encounter blew away part of Mars's upper atmosphere, much away part of Mars's upper atmosphere, much
away part of Mars's upper atmosphere,
much like a strong solar storm would. The main action took place during the comet's closest approach. but the planet's magnetosphere began to feel some effects as soon as it entered the outer edge of the comet's coma. A statement from the MAVEN team reads, "A Mars comet flyby caused a merging of magnetic fields from the comet and Mars. NASA was in the right place at the right time and was able to study what happens to a planet when a comet comes extremely close to a planet."
It'll be the brightest thing in the night or day sky. Won't be one sun in the sky, you'll see two suns. You'll know something bad is happening.
What it would do is it would boil off, essentially, the whole top of the Earth's atmosphere. And the consequences of that are very drastic.
First thing they'll do is take out our ozone layer. Completely take out all the ozone. Once you do that, by the way, the ozone is our defenses against high energy radiation. So if that shield gets knocked out, we are bare.
Without the protection of the ozone layer, everyone around you, even those hiding in their basements, would begin to get what looked like a bad sunburn from the gamma radiation as it penetrated into the Earth's crust.
This is light, has enough energy to completely decompose the molecules that are the stuff of life.
Temperatures would rise dramatically. People outside would be burnt by the ultraviolet radiation. Without an ozone layer, anything with eyes would eventually be blinded. We're talking about the end of all life as we know it.
Okay, so the scariest environment imaginable. Thanks. That's all you gotta say. Scariest environment imaginable.
My talk is going to be based on the Venus section of Worlds in Collision. It's not really the words of Dr. Velikovsky, but the survivors that he quotes and the description of the events that took place. The dates are not important. I'm comfortable with his dates, but it doesn't really matter. It could be Nibiru, it could be Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, but I'm comfortable with Venus as he thought.
Venus? No way, Jose. Actually, history tells us that many of the ancients believed it to be the planet Mars. However, we know definitively today that it is the Planet X system which caused these past catastrophes.
Get a different image there. The picture that's painted is dust, sand, gravel, rocks, very large boulders falling from the sky, mingled with a river of fire. Dr. Velikovsky thought that was oil. In many cases it might be, but it might also be plasma, similar to the aurora. The dust, sand, rocks, and gravel and boulders were mingled with a river of fire. According to the Mesoamericans, the rocks were glowing red hot. If you can heat a rock to incandescence, it would be much easier to heat dust. So you have molten material. The electromagnetism might pull in iron preferentially. It's raining oil for days and nights. The oil's running through rivers. People climb trees to escape it and drowned. According to the Mexicans, I think it killed more people than the rocks and everything else combined. There's a hurricane going on, beyond our description, worse than Andrew, which almost killed me. It might have, actually. The sun rises where it used to set. That's a tough one. And it could be a tippy top, but from what I see in the field, it really looks like it stopped rotating and went the other way. You can go to the headwaters of the Colorado River. Rocky Mountain National Park, Fraser, Colorado. I've spent quite a bit of time there. You can see the valleys are full of sediment to a large height, flat on both sides, equal height, as if water was pushed up from the equator. There's a 13.25-mile bulge of water at the equator because of centrifugal force. If the Earth ceases to rotate, according to Dr. Velikovsky, the water would rush north and south. The dust that's falling would be part of the flood. That is what I believe is the sediments up at the top of the Colorado drainage.
Now what he's doing here is giving this is one page of one book. One page of one book. He's giving a very compact, highly condensed observation of what happens in a pole shift. Observations based on what he found going around the planet and finding the evidence. It's titled A Working Hypothesis. Let us assume as a working hypothesis that under the impact of a force or the influence of an agent, and the Earth does not travel in an empty universe, the axis of the Earth shifted or tilted. At that moment, an earthquake would make the globe shudder. Air and water would continue to move through inertia. Hurricanes would sweep the Earth, and seas would rush over continents, carrying gravel and sand and marine animals, casting them on the land. Heat would be developed. Rocks would melt, volcanoes would erupt, lava would flow from fissures in the ruptured ground and covered vast areas. Mountains would spring up from the plains and would travel and climb on the shoulders of other mountains, causing faults and rifts. Lakes would be tilted and emptied. Rivers would change their beds. Large land areas with all their inhabitants would slip under the sea. Forests would burn. Hurricanes and wild seas would wrest them from the ground on which they grew and pile them, branch and root, in huge heaps. The seas would turn into deserts, their waters rolling away. And if a change in the velocity of the Earth's rotation, slowing it down, should accompany the shifting of the axis, the water confined to the equatorial oceans by centrifugal force would retreat to the poles, and high tides and hurricanes would rush from pole to pole, carrying reindeer and seals to the tropics and desert lines into the Arctic, moving from the equator up and down the mountain ridges of the Himalayas and down the African jungles, and crumbled rocks torn from splintering mountains would be scattered over large distances. And herds of animals would be washed from the plains of Siberia. The shifting of the axis would also change the climate of every place, leaving corals in Newfoundland and elephants in Alaska, fig trees in northern Greenland, and luxuriant forests in Antarctica. In the event of a rapid shift of the axis, many species and genera of animals on land and in the sea would be destroyed, and civilizations, if any, would be reduced to ruins.
Okay, so the scariest environment imaginable. Thanks. That's all you gotta say. Scariest environment imaginable.
Now, we're going to start today by talking about the days of Noah. Jesus, talking to his disciples, and it's recorded in Matthew 24, said, "But as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man." In other words, as it was, and which then prompts us to go back and look at the days of Noah and find out how they really were. So let's talk about that for a little bit. We have the creation of man. We have the antediluvian civilization. And I think more and more is being learned about that time period. And you've done considerable research yourself. So let's talk about what interests you about the days of Noah.
Well, Matthew refers to the days of Noah in a generic sense. I believe there's quite a number of aspects to the days of Noah. What interested me initially was the scientific approach. What caused the flood? What does the Bible say what happened to the earth before and after the flood? That gives us clues as to what happened. Is there evidence today that supports the theory as to what caused the flood? And is there any prophecies as to whether that event will reoccur in the future? Because if the phrase, as in the days of Noah, is true, very much all aspects of that time will be replicated in the future. And what I'm referring to specifically is we have come to the conclusion that part of one of these events is a pole shift that happened at that time, which was an instrumental part of the flood, which we feel the Bible supports it, and it also talks about an upcoming pole shift in the near future.
In other words, a pole shift then, which resulted in a flood. There'll be another pole shift in the future as described in Revelation.
Right.
But it will have a different effect than the one in the days of Noah.
In the scientific community, scientists have long considered a pole shift and the implications of a pole shift. During the days of Noah, it was very clear what type of pole shift we are talking about, a geographic pole shift, where the entire planet actually moves 23.5 degrees. Or the whole planet moves, in this particular case, it was 23.5 degrees. Now, there is a much, much, much more devastating type of pole shift that has never happened on the planet. It is a crustal pole shift. It is one where the axis of the Earth continues to spin the way it has been, but the entire outside crust of the planet suddenly shifts around the spinning axis. Now, remember when I said that the equator, wherever the equator is around the spinning axis, is about 20 kilometers wider? Well, as the crust shifts over this, the land literally has to rip apart in excess of 20 kilometers as it moves across the new equator and collapse back over. So it literally is going to rip apart most of the planet while this is happening. Think of just a quick analogy. Islands and mountains as carrots. They're on the surface, but their base goes far underground. And if you chop off every island and every mountain, if you take this verse literally, everyone on the planet, and everyone is moved simultaneously out of its place, you have a crustal pole shift. The more liquid center of the earth, the mantle, is stationary, and the crust is being ripped away from the center mantle. This type of pole shift would create lateral forces all over the planet, collapsing buildings, collapsing infrastructures, causing tsunamis, generating an EMP pulse from the center of the earth, basically disrupting all of our communication satellites. GPS would be down, all of our power grids would disappear. There would be massive high winds and an exponential increase in earthquakes all around the planet.
And islands being moved out of their places, that's not as easy as it sounds, because if, for example, the Hawaiian Islands are above the sea, but they widen out under the water, and they're on a very firm base.
In fact, the Old Testament refers to this as well. Like you mentioned, Isaiah 13:13 says that the earth will be moved out of her place, meaning it won't even be in the same orbit. Whatever causes this pole shift, this crustal mantle pole shift, is also going to alter the orbit of the earth. Isaiah 24, the earth will reel to and fro as a drunkard. It won't even have cycles anymore. If you were alive at that moment and you looked up in the sky, the sun is moving in this direction for a few hours, it slowly diverts and moves into a different direction. So this would be a horrible time. As far as anybody's concerned, it's the end of the world.
I want to stop you right there and go back to that subject about if you were on the earth in that day. You wouldn't be able to tell what time it was.
You wouldn't tell a time, and there's actually no day as well.
And I would, let's pursue that. But if the earth starts wobbling, everything that we use for timekeeping, which is the sun going across the heavens, suddenly
is lost. Your time doesn't work anymore.
It's completely lost. Let's suppose you are living at that time, and somebody walks up to you, just hypothetically, you're living, and all of this chaos is going on. Of course, all of technology is gone. Somebody walks up to you and says, "What day of the week is it?" Clearly, there is no day of the week. The sun went that way, it veered to the north, and before it could set, it veered to the east, set for a little bit, then came back up out of the east. The Earth is literally wobbling like a drunkard, and it is out of orbit. Now, so the person says, okay, forget that, that's too hard of a question.
Are you saying that no man knows the day or the hour?
No man knows the day or the hour. He'll ask you what time it is. There's no cycles.
Yeah.
So what do we have here? We have an event, literally an event that you could call nobody knows the day or the hour. An interesting part is that when Jesus was asked, when would he return, he described such a scenario. Nobody will know the day or the hour. And we know that when he returns, he brings the wrath of God with him for punishment on the unrepentant world, which is after this.
terror, for the day of the Lord has arrived. The time for the Almighty to destroy. Every arm is paralyzed with fear. Every heart melts, and people are terrified. Pangs of anguish grip them like those of a woman in labor. They look helplessly at one another, their faces aflame with fear. For see, the day of the Lord is coming, the terrible day of his fury and fierce anger. The land will be made desolate, and all the sinners destroyed with it.
I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder,
Come and see! Then everyone, the kings of the earth, the rulers, the generals, the wealthy, the powerful, and every slave and free person, all hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they cried to the mountains and the rocks,
Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come. Who can withstand? Everything they built will fall, and from the ashes of their world, we'll build a better one. Goddamn America! Goddamn America! Goddamn America!
I saw the end of the world. I could feel all this death.